I'd like to kick off with everybody sort of introducing themselves. We have a multidisciplinary panel here. We've got academia, we've got Mama Gaia herself and dance and movement and embodiment. Samantha Sweetwater. We have Brandon Peele, who he's a, forgive me for this, bro gone conscious. A term I love to use because I'm from the heartland, and there's a lot of us bros and broettes gone conscious. And he is a purpose guide and a true connector in this larger purpose field. And then we have Julian Norris here to my right, who is an underworld guide and has done a lot in terms of transforming education and outdoor education, and lives in the Colorado Rockies in the cold. The Canadian Rockies, sorry, thank you. And they just all bring such a unique perspective to the conversation. So I'd like you to introduce yourself with a little mini autobiography of your relationship to your own purpose. Please include juicy details that you wouldn't normally share with strangers, but that you will today. And then it's going to be short, so if you hear me go, then that means wrap it up. Okay, would you like to start, Julian?
Yes, but I might go on longer just to hear that sound again. Thank you. My name's Julian Norris, and I'm from England originally, and I live in the Canadian Rockies. And it's wonderful to be here on this territory of the Ohlone people originally, and increasingly where I come from, that's a reconciliation that's important to remember. You know, I feel like a visitor on this land. This question came alive for me probably as a young person. I left school when I was 15 years old, trying to self-initiate. Many of you may have done the same thing in all the wrong ways. And it ended up in a hospital bed, tied to this hospital bed I was tied for 4 months. I got run over by a car. I was in traction. A lot of pain, didn't know if I'd walk again at the age of just turned 16. And one night, a Franciscan monk walked into my little hospital room with his brown habit and read the clipboard at the end of my bed and came up to the side, didn't say anything to me, and this would never happen in California, but this was England in the early 80s, and he reached inside his habit and pulled out a packet of cigarettes. And he lit 2 of them, and he gave me one, and he, broad Irish accent, "So, Julian, why are you really here?" And his question broke me open, because of course that was the question I was longing to be asked. And so my work revolves around that question for myself, and bringing that both in the inward arc of finding that in the deepest way we can and our place of belonging, and also the outward arc of how we bring that back in service to all our relations, to our community. And right now that takes the form of being a business professor and a social innovator, program runner and an outdoor guide, and working with a group called the Animus Valley Institute that is thinking about this in terms of human soul and deep purpose. But it's taken many forms. You haven't made that noise yet, so I'm gonna
Thank you, Julian. Let's keep this train going.
Hello, my name is Brandon Peele, and I think like Julian, I also self-initiated quite a bit in my teens and 20s. I think by the time I was 27, I'd been arrested in 6 different states for having too much fun. And that's just what I got caught for. But yeah, so the kind of the bro gone conscious fits, and then for the 7 years after that was what I call like wandering the desert. So having a sense that this life that I'd been groomed for as an investment banker, venture capitalist, tech startup guy, was just a giant fucking lie. And so I came out here to San Francisco and just threw myself headfirst in all things personal and spiritual development. And while it was, foundational and, men's work, landmark, Vipassana, hallucinogens, Burning Man, like the whole menu of San Francisco psycho-spiritual development. It wasn't until I met Jonathan Gustin. Where is he? There he is. So now the founder of the Purpose Guys Institute. And Jonathan had been very foundational in kind of helping me see some things from my childhood that were a little messed up. And then he asked me, he's like, well, you don't know your purpose, do you? I'm like, oh, of course not. There's no such thing. We're all floating and it's meaningless. And he introduced me to this idea that you could have a soul purpose and be committed to spiritual enlightenment and also kind of be a massive change agent in the world. And working with him was foundational, and it informed so much of who I am now. And I don't know what else to say. I mean, that is... yeah. I'll just say that I'm as a purpose guide and an author and a movement whipper-upper. That's how I do it now.
Hi, everybody. My name's Samantha Sweetwater. It's really beautiful to see you all here, see us all. My journey started really early with being born. Some of my earliest memories are memories of knowing that this lifetime was a make or break lifetime for our species. And so in a sense, like my core purpose has been driven from being a very little person with a deep sense of ethical and in a way aesthetic and empathic imperative to come back into co-creation with our planet. And that's shaped my entire life in many ways. And then at the age of 13, I started, despite my parents' reluctance, I started locking myself in a wrestling room at my high school and creating dances about spiritual states with no names and why people get along and why they don't. And what if if I grabbed other kids and we started to experiment with this, what would we learn? And asking really big questions of my peers, like, what does this all mean? And what makes you feel? And what makes it feel good or just feel period? And what's the fabric of meaning for human beings? So and I also, my other refuge was being in nature. And I would sneak away from my house, even though my mom wouldn't let me. She thought I had a best friend who I hung out with all the time. And instead, I was driving to the woods to go on long nature hikes by myself in high school. So my life has been my purpose has been driven by a passion for embodiment and a passion for connecting with the earth and a deep inquiry about how do we create a spiritual narrative and a consciousness narrative about our meaning as a species that integrates what's rising in our consciousness as a knowledge of what and who we are as consciousness and a heartbroken empathy with our planet. And so that's what I do. These days, I founded in a global movement phenomenon called Dancing Freedom and trained people all over the world. And then dance ceased to be my passion, which was super disorienting. That's a really good thing to look at in this movement is what do you do when the passion plug gets unplugged and you get to find a whole new medium for your purpose. And so I'm an evolutionary soul mentor, and I'm a medicine woman, and now I'm a performer as Mama Gaia. And getting to have this opportunity that you'll experience later of speaking from how the planet speaks to me.
Everybody just made the natural sound. Thank you, Samantha. Aneel.
I'm Aneel, and I guess me in three points. My mom's in the audience, so she's right back there. And that anchors me as a teenager, crying in my room, yearning for a vehicle through which to express purpose, and not having it in high school. Then I fast forward to being a high school teacher, because I was down in Salinas at Everett Alvarez High School, teaching physics and math, teaching everything from remedial algebra to advanced placement physics. I did have students die. We had a 35% graduation rate. I saw the entire spectrum. That's what propelled me into studying psychology. I needed a better toolkit when this student, I actually know their names, I'm not going to say it, but I can see their face locked in time. This student doing sex work in the bathrooms at school. This student taking care of her 2 younger sisters while her mom was away for 2 weeks on the other side of the country. She was 16, and so on. And this student shot dead, and the 18-person fight I helped break up that erupted. And now I went back into psychology, get a better toolkit. And now I'm in a society where 35 to 40%, I just actually did, the number resonance didn't occur to me until about 13 and a half minutes ago, right there. 35% graduation rate, 35 to 40% of US adults are languishing. So I'm an educator at this point. Again, still, that's my core. I'm an educator. I'm an experiential program builder and a researcher in convenience. So.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing your relationship to your own purpose. And I'd like to, what we're going to do is just ask a few questions, and then we'll hear the voice of the audience. So if you have a question, feel free to write it down, because we'll circle back. I'd like to stay on this point of languishing for a moment, because I feel in my own journey, there's been times where I've definitely been in the experience of languishing. And when I've talked about it to people, they're like, oh, maybe you're going through depression. They want to rush you out of it. And then when I read Bill Plotkin's Soulcraft, it was like, stay in it, go deeper. And so I'm just curious in this conversation about languishing and flourishing and finding your purpose, and that challenge takes on, what do you feel the role of kind of this purpose journey and languishing can play into a human flourishing experience? And whoever would like to take it. You're so polite. Just jump in there.
I am trained as a clinical psychologist. I don't practice as one. I have a couple former clinical psychology friends in the audience, literally, who moved on to do other things too. When you say depression, I think of that in this very particular way. I will say I would not recommend wallowing in clinical depression. I mean that serious. It's hard, and it's brutal, and it's tough. I would say if you're experiencing mental illness, mental illness is a social construction, but it also connects to our brain-body systems from my point of view. I would really want to resource and support that person to come out and emerge from that depression. It's a hard state. For any of us who have worked and seen that close up, I do not want someone to wallow there. What I would say is the narrative around that experience as you emerge from it does matter. And if I can find a purpose-based narrative, then the way in which I make meaning around it will then potentially plant the seeds of wisdom and that flow of purpose from going through a hell of an experience. and emerging out of that experience with a sense of empathy, compassion, and hopefully purpose that spills out into the world. So I just wanted to kind of respond in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. When I first came to America, I lived in what turned out to be the poorest county in the United States, which is Zeebec County in South Dakota, on the Cheyenne River Reserve, and extraordinary languishing. And it's a different kind of languishing. It's in Martin Brokenleg's model of healthy kind of human development, he starts with this idea of belonging. And it speaks to belonging to yourself, belonging in culture, and having some fundamental needs met. But once those needs are met, once you've achieved that, and many of us struggle our whole lives to experience that, that's the point in the journey of the psyche that we need to leave our house of belonging. That's the point that we think that that's what cultural success looks like, but that's the point at which we have to sort of burn down the house in some way. And it's a different kind of languishing. It's a chosen separation. It's a cocooning. It's a kind of longing to connect with, to go deeper into that inward arc. But you can't go there if you haven't achieved the basic fundamentals. Those are core.
Thank you, Julian. Samantha, did you want to add?
Well, I would say, there's a lot of dimensions to that question, but the story you tell about it is incredibly important. And I think that it's important to have an ally in that place. And something I end up doing a lot, I think there's to use terms we're using, I think, too much lately, but there's more of a masculine dimension of navigating through it, through structure and regimen, and are you taking care of yourself, and what's your morning routine, and does that feel okay to have that? And who's your check-in points who are holding you in this? And there's a more feminine dimension, which is really patient and really embodied and nonlinear. And I think as stewards of purpose, as a steward of purpose, I find that it's my job to hold space for both of those, and that shows up all the time with my clients. And that it's important as a purpose mentor to not drive people through it because I'm invested in getting to a destination. But it's a very, very delicate balance. Everyone who's a caregiver, supporter for people in this process, because we can kind of jumpstart the soul's timing, but you can't fast track it. Like the soul, I think the soul is the stubbornest part of our being, and that alchemy is being able to shift the pacing at which our souls evolve. But it's beyond my knowledge, my understanding. It's a both and. It's a divine timing piece that we're also increasing with all of the tools that we bring to bear in transformation. So I find that it's that both and of holding space for the destinationless process that will have its emergence in its own divine time. Because a huge suffering about suffering is I'm trying to get help to get through this and I can't get through it, so fuck that. So there's this really delicate balance in true languishing that in that place. It is a huge suffering, and it needs to be held, and it needs to be pushed and steered, but it also needs to just be allowed.
I wanted to add one thing. I think what you said sparked sort of a connected perspective. We humans are meaning-making organisms. If we're stripped of our meaning-making apparatus, we are sort of neutered of the basic ability to be human. And so I want to draw a triangle, sort of meaning, values, and purpose. Meaning-making is the foundation, my basic sort of sense of identity and who I am and what the world is like and how I make sense of it. The values are my touchstones, usually implicit, that orient my life and my being. And then the purpose is, I think, the vector that gives some directionality to our intention. And if I'm deeply languishing, I do think that spark of the question of what is my identity, who am I, and how do I make meaning in the world? Are these symptoms me, or am I something other than these symptoms? Is there something going on in society, like, the weapons of mass distraction, right? As many people call them. I know Mikey's here somewhere in the room, consciousness hacking, the idea of, can we rebuild tech in a way that tech is supportive of human flourishing? Can we rebuild human systems, right? So I want to mention that, like, identity and meaning making on the individual and the group and the societal level, sparking into a sense of our values, vectored into our purpose. I think that does matter a lot.
It kind of brings up to me, because I know you've all worked in different fields and purpose making. In your experience, what has been some of the key ways and tools that you've helped people that you've been around with journey in their own purpose discovery? And what are some things that you're like, ooh, I wouldn't do that again?
Yeah, so I'm going to be real simple about this. Without supervision, it can be really dangerous. Like, you could just make up some conclusion after an exercise or reading some book about, like, oh yeah, I found my purpose, I'm a marketer. I mean, people buy what color is your parachute all the time and come up with insanely inaccurate conclusions about their soul's purpose. And I don't mean that, like, everyone needs to hire a purpose guy. What I mean is, like, there has to be some kind of structure. What I mean is, like, whether it's a guided visualization, whether it's like a deconstructive process, like, Tim Kelly's looking at the different ego parts, critic, skeptic, image consultant, wounded child, protector, that there has to be some kind of attention and accountability to the process, where there's something else, whether it's a mentor, a group of friends who are doing the work together, that, like, purpose can only really happen in relationship, in like a we space, whether that's with a guide, in a community, but this kind of Western male individualist thing, like, well, I can just sit there and long enough, I can find out my purpose. Like, no, you won't. Like, purpose is not about realizing the nothingness, like the Buddha. Like, that, any idiot can do that. Like, purpose is about, like as you were saying, like, in the languishing, dwelling in the discomfort long enough for that alchemy to, like, sort the wheat and the chaff, for the voices of the ego and the voices of the soul to kind of naturally separate. And the role of that kind of that surface of the alchemist is to look. It's a mirror, saying, okay, well, what's true and what's kind of in the way. And so specific practices, guided visualizations, questing, going on the land, with intention, certain medicine ceremonies, and then Tim Kelly's book. Have somebody hold the space for you to break apart your ego, because even if you just do that, all that will emerge is soulful purpose.
I feel like I need to add something to that. I'd love to add to that joy. I think, one of the most profound and easy pathways to finding your purpose is doing whatever you need to do to reconnect with your body and your heart and your experience of joy and empathy and connection with the world. I think one of the things I get concerned about is there's such a strong messaging about go within, go within, go within. And to me, like, purpose is an intersubjective field. It's a relational field. So I don't think we can source meaning and purpose just by going within. I think that is narcissistic and limited, and I think we can achieve a certain level of liberation of cause by going within, and we can receive inner guidance by going within. And I think that part of what's broken about the whole experience of being humans is the depth of the intimacy we're actually evolved to have with each other and the planet. And that is the fabric of soul. The fabric of soul is a web of interpenetrated relationships of specificities that I like to say to my students, like, non-specificity is a form of sabotage. And what I mean by that is like the devil and the angels are in the details. And so and I'm saying that as an and, but dance, I work with plant medicine because I find that is a great way to get out of the searching and the trying and really deeply be penetrated and opened to relationship. I work with embodiment. I work with pleasure. And there's a deeper tuning to what feels like soul pleasure that isn't necessarily pleasurable in the like I'm happy or this is yummy kind of way, but I call it following the feel good. And you can feel when you're in it.
Okay.
Aneel, then Julian.
Yeah. Part of my identity is as a social scientist, so I am going to uphold a social science view on this. Part of my identity is as a contemplative practitioner, so I'm going to uphold that as well. But I do want to mention 3 models relatively quickly that I think are useful. One is the one I referenced, Corey Key's model, the 2 continua model, which looks at flourishing in 3 domains. Some part positive emotion, happiness, joy, pleasure, things like this. Some part positive emotion. Some part psychological well-being at its central axis being purpose. Am I contributing to something bigger than myself? Do I feel connected to a sense of purpose? These types of questions. Do I have a sense of balance? And then one part social well-being. Am I connected to a community? Am I plugged into people who provide mutually loving relationships, right? There's also the PERMA model of Martin Seligman out of UPenn, PERMA, positive emotions, engagement and flow, relationships, meaning and purpose, achievements, right, that matter. And then out of Stanford, the Well for Life, there's a 10-factor model. So if you Google Well for Life and you want to be a part of their research, I think that's going to be emerging what I think is going to be the most ecological and inclusive model. So if you Google Well for Life Stanford, they're collecting data. You can participate in the research. I think those are good. 2 things that I see missing from all of them. One is the role of technology. Users of technology, experiencers of technology, we're in a tech everywhere world. We must accommodate an understanding of technology, what it is and its role in our lives. And 2, truly the deep role of contemplative practice, of meditation, of spirituality. So.
I think this has changed for me over the years. I used to feel like I needed to do something a lot more and have models and really clear things I was doing. And if I was to describe it, it would be something like, I feel like both a student of nature and a relationship counselor. And the relationship is between, we could say, the ego and the soul. And so much of what probably feels shallow to many of us in this kind of work is where the ego is trying to get a hold of the soul and colonize it for its own purposes again. And by ego, I'm meaning the aperture through which we understand ourselves to be, who we think we are, rather than in a sort of negative sense. We need a healthy ego. It's our way of being in the world, engaging with the world. But somehow the ego longs to be in that interpenetrating, intimate relationship with soul, and soul longs to be in that relationship with ego. Both the solar and the lunar aspects of our being. And And that's a conversation. That's a lifelong conversation. Sometimes it's a languishing conversation. Sometimes it's a joyful, flourishing conversation. There are hints of it when we feel most alive and vibrant. But somehow my work feels like getting these two strangers together. Soul meet ego, ego have a conversation with soul, and to invite people to fall into the deepest possible conversation they can have uniquely with themselves and the world. And it is different for everybody. You know, context is everything. You know, what's the difference between a lama in a cave in Tibet right now and a guy on a 3 strikes out in solitary confinement in a California jail? Context. They're both experiencing the same sort of things, but utterly differently. And so inviting people into that place and inviting them to inhabit the niche that only they can inhabit. And I don't know what that is, and none of us know what that is. And it's a beautiful, potent place, and somehow it calls us to be students of, you know, principles. Emmanuel talked about those operating guidelines that describe reality this morning. The original instructions of the universe, and somehow we have the same thing with, and you're within us, without us, you know, it's only expressed in relationship. It's only expressed in relationship, and you know, this idea that somehow just going in is the only way. I totally agree with that. We have to find it in all our relations, in all of our relationships. So. Inviting people into a conversation, and that looks really different at different points. It's not a vocation. I teach in the most conservative business school in Canada, probably, you know, the heart of the oil patch. And I get every MBA student before they leave. And my dean has told me, your job, the reason we hired you is to change the consciousness of our staff and our students. And that's my job description. And that's great. It doesn't look like it when I hand out the business card, but it feels like that's the vocation. The vocation is inviting people into a conversation at this time where everything's unraveling and the meaning-making structures are falling apart. It feels like the most important conversation we could have.
Thank you all. What a varied answers to that question. So I'm going to ask you one more question. I'm going to have you keep the answer really tight. And I'm also going to ask you to bear with the question itself. So here we go. There's a man out there named John who once said, it came to him that like purpose could be kind of what the industry of mindfulness has become. And a lot of, Aneel, as you were saying, purpose without context isn't enough. And I just want to take that to a larger scale, because purpose without the context of human flourishing can be super dangerous. And like we see it happening in different kind of human movements that have been destructive and dangerous. So in your estimations, how do we keep human flourishing at the core of this purpose, of the purpose field, of the purpose work, in whatever way? I know not all of you are technical purpose practitioners, but in your various fields. And it's going to be kind of like a minute 15 each.
Quick answer, decoupling the essential practice of it from profit motives. In mindfulness, we have, you know, authentic mindful practitioning and practitionership going on. We also have an ecosystem of mindfulness, aspects of which have really calcified into a mindfulness industrial complex. And so if we are focused on the value, not necessarily the profit, I think that's one of the key pieces. The value that it promotes in the world for other people around us and for ourselves. That would be my quick answer.
Thank you so much.
I think my quick answer is beauty, intimacy, and grief. And because tech is driving the conversation in a lot of ways, because money is driving the conversation, which is also driven by what we consume, The conversation happens in terms that can be proven, that are neat and clean, that are bullet pointable, that are predominantly masculine in their metrics and in their tone. They're very left brain. And I think the restoration of right brain meaning making is fundamental to that process. And again, that's a relational part of our brain, but it's also an aesthetic part. It's a part where we meet the feminine dimensions of our consciousness, our feelings, our care, our compassion, our stuckness, our wonder.
This is probably one of the most important questions, I think, here today. And because so much of personal and spiritual development is decoupled from that context, it can be really narcissistic and destructive. And, you know, as a guide, I've actually built worldview into my model of purpose. That has to be cultivated and evolved and named. Like, what is your grandest, most elegant understanding of the cosmos? And how is your soul's purpose in relationship to it? You know, Bill Plotkin talks about niche. It's like, I think Bill's writing is probably the most elegant and eloquent about purpose being in relationship to everything. And so you have to understand everything. You have to understand what is actually happening. Like a surface level understanding of politics, history, philosophy, ecology, psychology, cosmology. I mean, you have to really get what the world is to truly inhabit the fullness of your purpose. If your worldview is tiny, I can tell you, you're going to be empowered, but you're going to be walking around a 3-foot square of cement, and your purpose is going to suck. And it's not going to look cool. It's not going to be fun. You're going to get bored with it, and then you're going to make it wrong, and then go back to the matrix. So you got to have a huge, massive worldview so that your soul can rise to fill that container.
It's not going to happen. We're not stopping the shallow purpose revolution. Just as you can buy, shamanic pillows and Native American wisdom cards and, mindfulness socks and everything else. Every one of these authentic hungers will also manifest in its kind of most shallow and materialist form. And the answer is also really simple for me anyway. It's not worrying about that part. It's by staying as authentically true to your own purpose as you can and really hungering for that and living it into the world. In a world that has Buddha in a box, you still have to go and do the practice. And out of that kind of crazy, materialist mess, there is a core of great mindfulness research and great authentic Buddhist practitioners in America and wonderful folks who've dived deeply into this thing. And so I think it calls us more deeply into the very heart of this thing. But we're not going to stop it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. The voice of the audience. You heard my inner dialogue with my questions, and now we want to hear yours. Okay, sir, in the hot pink shirt. Let me pass my microphone.
Thank you. Thank you all. My name is Artie Eggendorf. I'm the Vietnam vet who put PTSD on the map with my study for Congress in 1981. Wrote a book, Healing from the War, and at the end, in 1985, I wrote, Healing for Veterans, a life will come when we can bring joy, all of us singly and together, to live in joy. It took 25 years. A fusion of meditation, yoga, energy healing, and energy science came to me. It's about bringing toroidal dynamics into the body and moving. Yes, I do. Do you notice what I do, which is several times we've had an issue here where the one woman among four speaks up for what has been predominantly a male conception of all this is missing a whole number of things. And I'll just ask Mr. Neil, how graciously you responded to me. What would happen if you brought the way you responded to me? After I said all this to him, he said, could you give me a hug? Or could I give you a hug? If you would bring the preeminence of that response into how you talk about this, how would it sound? What terms would you use?
Okay. Thank you.
Why does it have to be a question? Why can't it just be a word and notice?
It's hard to hear outside of myself. So my honest answer is your question motivates in me the opportunity to reflect on what is my tone, how am I speaking about this? So I don't know how, maybe when I'll go back and watch the video and learn about myself from a third person, but that's my honest answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Question asking. So if you have a question, think about it and perhaps write it down so that you can give a very specific question to our panelists here. And I think throughout the session, because we'll have a lot of time to interact and share observations outside of the panels and things like that. So do we have a question?
So a couple of you have mentioned plant-based medicines, and I'm just curious how you feel about the role of entheogens in your personal practice and perhaps legacy of how you've gotten here in terms of ego dissolution or helping open the soul's idea to purpose.
Super hot question. Let's not get stuck on this one, okay? Strong opinion question. I'll just answer from the plant's perspective. From the plant's perspective, we're very interesting organisms seeking to be more co-creative with the planet. And each plant has a different perspective. I work with plants. I really don't work a lot with synthetics. I think synthetics are a little dangerous if we're talking about, I don't want to use even the word dangerous. They're useful for all kinds of things in terms of breaking through ego structure. They're less useful for empathy. They're actually synthetics in general are very tuning to what is self-generating, which is awesome, but they're not tuned well to what is co-creative with beyond the human field. So humans are anthropocentric by nature. We're extremely homocentric. So plants are really interested in how we become co-creative with the more than human world through various lenses that each plant has a different lens. And I could go very deep into that conversation, but I don't want to take up too much time. But the short answer is, from the plant's perspective, we have a great opportunity to crack open to a more co-creative place in being. And they're not so interested, I talk about a medicine ego, which is an integrated experience of beyond self and self, that when one does the work wisely and in supervised ways with a skilled practitioner and community reflecting you, that there is the opportunity to continuously tune one's ego structure in a way that is both more connected to what is beyond the self and more connected to other people and the eco field in a way that is very different than a mindfulness-based process and much more fluid. So it's more right-brained and less concerned with it depends on which plant, I will say. But it's more interested in how we are shaped by being cracked open to our co-creativity with everything. And also by the dissolution of stories, or if it's ayahuasca, like eating your head off or eating off little bits of persistent ego. She's great at doing all kinds of things that are very obvious. But it's a process of developing a more attuned and co-creative experience of self. From the plant's perspective, that's what's interesting about us, is that we're so ideal for so much relatedness, for so much co-createdness. And you need other people, you need a good practitioner, you need a safe space. There's a lot of things like not to do in that process. If you want to talk with me about it, talk with me off stage. I'm very happy to talk about this in great detail.
Did anyone else have anything they wanted to add to that? Okay.
I would just add, for me, 4 days before getting run over, I said a prayer and ate 1,000 psilocybin mushrooms. Getting run over turned out to be the answer to the prayer. I just didn't realize it was the answer for a long time, actually. And you know, there's so many people doing interesting things in this space. And you know, in research that I've done with people working at sort of the deepest levels in very mainstream environments, the taboo part of their work that they always want to say, well, this is important, but I can't really have this in the public domain yet because of the nature of the way this conversation's held. But this was, and then they proceed to share some, you know, very significant part of a relationship with, you know, plant medicine or something like this. So I think that's shifting. And two other pieces I'm really curious. One is about those plants also belong in an ecosystem and a cultural system. And you know, when they're taken wildly out of those things, it's sometimes really easy to escape the bounds of community and the sort of safeguards that have evolved in those relationships. And you know, we see that a lot. And the other piece is, and when you've glimpsed some peace, how do you then, just like a dream or a numinous encounter of some other kind or a spiritual experience, having it on its own, it changes you in a certain way, but really how you then pick that up and stay in relationship with that is the transformational process, which might take years.
Thank you. Yes, question over here.
So I've been hearing a lot of talk about this thing called purpose journey. And it seems like the narrative has always been you start here and the purpose is there and somehow you're going to get there. And yet I feel like so much of this path is that we're confronted with the act of making decisions and this, we have to make choices. And being a millennial, we are the generation that's overwhelmed with this burden of choices coming at us from media, from social networks. And it almost comes down as a burden. So on this journey of purpose, when it's nonlinear, how do you focus your energy and focus your intentions in a way that you can make the best possible decisions that will get you there?
Yeah. So one of the places I actually have my clients and students start out in is actually listening to the call, like what actually is out there that most resonates with your deepest heartbreak. That's the cheat sheet. Because we all care about, especially in the Bay Area, we care about so many things. Democracy reform, the environment, social justice. You know, there's a gazillion places for you to put your energy and they'd be well spent. But there's only one right now that is going to basically be your deepest fulfillment. And so the work I do is like bring people into that deepest heartbreak. So what was most missing in your life that is also missing out there in the world, that you can contribute your strengths, your gifts, you know, your craft, your life's work, and heal yourself through healing the world and vice versa. It becomes this like path to wholeness, both internally and externally, that kind of Jungian macro microcosm coming in and out. So it's an organic process. It's not a strategic boil the ocean, find the best place to make a difference process. It's like, no, this breaks my heart. So for me, like what breaks my heart is tyrant and abdicator kingship. Like, so my heart's breaking a lot right now. And it calls me to my greatness. It calls me to look at where I'm being that way and how I can better serve and anoint more queens and kings in the world. And so that's my invitation to you, is like really go into that heartbreak. Stay in the discomfort, get depressed safely, get angry safely, Like get down and on the carpet, wail, beat something up, like get to the place where you're like, this and only this.
I want to say one additional principle that I actually forgot to mention from my point of view. Purpose finding is addition and subtraction. So my question would be, what are you going to subtract out of your choice field? Because there's really good research on the paradox of choice. If I have too many choices, then I'm less fulfilled with any given choice that I make. So what's the framework you're using to create subtraction, not just addition? So a simple exercise could be, what are your 5 core values? How do you define each one in your words? And then what do 2 behaviors look like in a day-to-day, week-to-week manner that is an expression of each of those values? Then go hunt around in that. Maybe it helps sift some of the answers. Subtraction, not just addition.
We have time for one more quick question, if you'd like. Laura, did you have your hand up?
So, in the search for purpose, we're all looking for, as Sam was saying, this something that really fulfills us and inspires us. And yet, so many of us are driven by paying the bills, right? Like, maybe we have to worry about whether Volkswagen is outselling Chevys, or, how do you see the relationship between the fulfillment of purpose within ourselves and our life's work? And how essential is it that the two be the exact same thing?
Great question. The soul's dance and the survival dance. Another way we often think about it at Animus is something like the wellspring and the aqueducts that bring the water to your people. And the reality is, for many of us, we have all kinds of things that, and I would say they're not misaligned with purpose. There's, singular purpose might be the, one way of thinking about purpose, but then there's relational purpose and how you show up in family networks or community, and the sorts of purposes that come before us in the moment. If somebody falls over with a heart attack on the stage right now, our purpose is dealing with that right now. So at one level, you could say, well, sometimes you find that outside of your vocation, and those are separate things, and you follow that. And but what seems to happen for most people, the more they blow on the embers of their soul's unique way of belonging in the world, the less tolerant they are of things that are divergent to that, or the more stress that divergence causes. Relationships, ways of making a living, really anything. And so there is no simple answer, because the truth is, once you really dive in there, you don't know what's going to happen. And you could say the very best way to go on a journey of exploration with that is to burn the ships, like leave. People show up on programs at Animus where they've sold the home and they've packed things in the car and they don't know where they're going to go next, deliberately, so they take that jigsaw puzzle piece that is them and they sort of blow up the system. But many of us, we don't have that privilege to be able to do that, or we have responsibilities to children and relatives and all kinds of others. So somehow, if we stay in that conversation, and it takes a lot of courage to be in that conversation, and we really listen to the way in which it wants to have its way with us, it will answer that question, because there is no singular answer to that question.
I want to name that. I think it's important. Depende, as my spiritual father would say. Depende. But I think inside the movement there is such an I'm a huge advocate for creating work that is a reflection of one's purpose. And at the same time, I think inside the movement, there is such a push towards that it can create a lot of suffering around suffering. Because it's important not to always moor one's vocation to that purpose. And I just have to tell you guys about this woman who I met she was behind the desk of a car rental place in Phoenix, Arizona. And I got off a plane doing purpose, I was coming from a very purposeful place. And I said, hi, and she looks at me, she's like, you are on purpose. And I said, I just went with the game. I wasn't sure if that was true at that moment. And I said, yeah. And she said, well, I'm so happy because I am on purpose. I am so on purpose. She was robust, beautiful, voluptuous, older African-American woman. And her purpose was happiness and to bring happiness. And she was sitting behind the desk of that place, and she told me, we had a great conversation, very long one, about her life story and how she ended up in Sedona. And I have never met anyone more on purpose than this woman sitting behind the desk of a car rental place, spreading light, holy, holy light. And so I think of her sometimes. She's like one of my guides, and I wanted to bring her into the space because that's a fantastic story about how it depende.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to speak, but I'm going to speak on this one. I see it a little differently. My social justice lens goes off sometimes, and not everyone has access to the vehicles of purpose making that are equally available to myself or many of us in this room. And so I think there are an incredible number of jobs that earn a decent income that can be amazing vehicles of purpose finding. I think purpose finding is imperfect. I think we often need to ask what's good enough. And then what's good enough, how do we maximize that vehicle? And I would say, for myself, I really try to ask myself, am I showing up in a way as a program builder that is enhancing vehicles for purpose for my students, for people in the world? Or what are my blind spots? I have plenty. And how am I trying to do that systematically and on a systems level? Because I do agree with, this is a both and, right? I think this definitely, for sure. And I just felt like I have to say that too. There's an equality of opportunity question here. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists. You've been on the spot, and it's just not going to stop yet. We've got 3 more minutes, so I'd like to just close out with each panelist sharing one question they hold around this work, because we're all in this grappling with these ancient questions, and there are some answers, and there are many, many left in the universe. So if you could just tap into a question that you have, and then we'll close on that.
So I love gimmicks, and and I want to figure out how we can take this kind of purpose phenomenon and rapidly get people excited about the question. And the question I'm holding is how do we do that without losing an ounce, a gram of the sacredness and the importance and the fun and the reverence and the mystery? How does this not become some kind of McDonald's version of purpose?
This is a very different language, but I think the question I actually ask the most is, how do we awaken our original instructions? And what that means is, in many indigenous narratives, our original instructions as a species, which is a vocational question, are to tend and steward the earth. And it's a belief, but it's also an experience that I have that's actually true to our sense of meaning in like a hugely diverse way. So that's my question. Is how do we awaken that?
Scaling is a very popular word in this part. My question is, how do we scale this with depth, authenticity, and awareness?
Nice. So that was my question. So I'll go with, at this time when everything is unraveling, when so many of us feel somewhat born for this moment, what does it mean to be truly human?
Let's give a round of applause.